Have you ever thought about what happens, like, in a country where justice is, meant to hold everyone accountable, but a bullet meant for one person hits someone else?
Yeah.
And especially when that someone else is a child who's totally innocent.
Oh, absolutely. It really raises those tough questions about how the law can even begin to address such a devastating mistake.
Like, can the law really grapple with that? Can it really capture how complex it is when someone makes a mistake like that leads to the loss of innocent life?
Right, because you have the intention versus the actual outcome
Mm.
and how those two things clash.
Exactly. Well, welcome to the deep dive, where we take those kinds of tough questions and we dig deep into significant legal cases that really make you think about the stories behind the rulings and how the law actually works in real life.
And today we're diving into a Supreme Court case that really shook people up
Yeah, it did.
because it's not just about the law, it's also about a really, really heartbreaking human tragedy.
It really is. So for this deep dive, we've been poring over the Supreme Court decision in People of the Philippines v. Nestor Bendecio y Viejo alias Tan, GR number 235016, dated September 2020.
A mouthful, but an important one.
Oh, for sure. And what we're trying to do here is to unpack all the legal intricacies and the human side of this case. So we're going to be looking at the concept of criminal intent, what the law calls mistake of the blow, and how complex crimes are handled in the Philippine legal system.
It's a lot to unpack, but I think our listeners are ready for the challenge.
Oh, I know they are. They're always up for it. All right, so let's get to the heart of the matter. What actually happened in this case?
So this all took place on December 24th, 2011, Christmas Eve, in Muntinlupa City.
Oh, wow, right before Christmas.
Yeah.
Hmm.
The accused is a man named Nestor Bendecio y Viejo, also known as Tan. His intended victim was Gerry Marasigan y Campit. But tragically, the bullet not only hit Gerry, it fatally struck his 7-year-old daughter, Jonabel Marasigan.
Oh, my goodness.
She was born on November 1st, 2004. And Gerry's sister, Princess Marasigan, was also injured in the incident.
So there were multiple victims here.
Yes, unfortunately.
So how did this all start?
Well, from what we understand, the shooting happened after an encounter between Nestor and Gerry, where Nestor felt that Gerry had been disrespectful.
Oh, okay. So there was some kind of conflict brewing between them.
Right. And later that day, as Gerry and his wife were coming back home, Gerry was closing their door, and Nestor, who was outside, fired a handgun.
This is a stark reminder of how easily things can escalate, like a disagreement turning into something unimaginable.
You said it.
Okay, so Nestor fired the gun. What happened next?
The bullet, it missed Gerry,
Oh, wow.
but it hit Jonabel in the chest, and then it went on to hit Princess in the legs.
So much damage.
Absolutely. And both Gerry and Princess ended up testifying in court for the prosecution.
Yeah.
And their testimony was very important because they both positively identified Nestor as the shooter.
Right, so they're eyewitnesses. That's usually pretty strong evidence.
Exactly. Now, Nestor, he had a completely different story.
Oh.
He claimed that he was actually in Samar at the time of the shooting.
Samar, that's pretty far from Muntinlupa.
He had quite a distance. He said that he knew Gerry because Gerry was a neighbor to his sister's tenant, but insisted that there was no reason for Gerry to accuse him.
So basically we have two very different sides to the story.
Exactly. Two completely opposing versions of what happened.
So with all of that, how did the lower courts handle this case? Where did it go first?
It started in the Regional Trial Court, or RTC. And the RTC, after looking at all the evidence, they found Nestor guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay.
And they found him guilty of a very specific crime, a complex crime called attempted murder with homicide. The court believed Gerry and Princess, their testimonies, and they rejected Nestor's alibi. They said it wasn't backed up by any evidence.
It sounds like the RTC really focused on the fact that there was an intent to kill, even though the intended victim wasn't the one who ended up dying.
Yes, and that's a crucial part of how the courts approached this case. Now, what's interesting is that the RTC decided on a specific punishment.
Okay, what was that?
They gave him something called an indeterminate sentence. So it ranged from 12 years of prison mayor at the maximum period as the minimum, all the way to 20 years of reclusion temporal at its maximum period as the maximum.
Okay, so a range of possible prison time.
Right. But on top of that, they also ordered Nestor to pay Jonabel Marasigan's family a whole bunch of money.
For what?
Well, it included 75,000 pesos for civil indemnity, 75,000 for moral damages, 30,000 for temperate damages, and another 75,000 for exemplary damages. And all of that with 6% annual interest from the date the decision became final.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And the RTC's reasoning was that Nestor's initial intention to harm Gerry led to this combination of crimes. Now, they did recognize treachery in the attempted killing of Gerry, but they didn't apply that to Jonabel's death.
So that's an important distinction.
It is. Now, the case didn't end there. It went up to the Court of Appeals, or CA.
Oh, okay. And what did they say?
Well, the CA, they agreed that Nestor was guilty, but they changed the classification of the crime a bit.
Really? How so?
They said it wasn't attempted murder with homicide. They called it attempted murder with murder.
Attempted murder with murder.
Yep. And this actually increased the penalties significantly to reclusion perpetua. Basically, life in prison in the Philippines. They also upped the temper damages to 50,000 pesos.
So the CA saw things a bit differently than the RTC, huh?
Yeah, they did. But they did stick with the RTC's assessment of the witnesses. They agreed that Gerry and Princess were believable, and they also agreed that Gerry was the intended victim, which led to the attempted murder charge. But they added this idea of treachery.
Treachery.
Yeah, because the attack was sudden and unexpected, the classic definition. Now, this is where the legal concept of mistake in the blow comes in. It's like the legal term for when you aim at one thing and accidentally hit another.
Right, and I remember we talked about that earlier.
Exactly. And the CA considered Jonabel's death as Aberratio Ictus, which is Latin for mistake in the blow.
Okay, that makes sense. But how did they justify calling it murder?
That's where things get really interesting. They said that because Jonabel was only 7 years old, she was totally defenseless in that kind of attack. And that, they argued, was basically the same as treachery.
That's a pretty powerful argument. Saying that because of her age and her inability to protect herself, she was essentially in the same position as if the attack had been intentionally planned against her.
Exactly. It's like saying that her vulnerability fulfills that requirement for treachery, even though she wasn't the original target.
So we've got these two courts, both finding Nestor guilty, but with slightly different interpretations. So what was the main question that went up to the Supreme Court?
The Supreme Court had to decide if the CA got it right. Did they correctly convict Nestor of the complex crime of attempted murder with murder?
So they were essentially reviewing the CA's legal reasoning.
Exactly. Especially their conclusion that Jonabel's death was, in fact, murder, and that this all led to a complex crime.
So what did the Supreme Court decide?
In the end, the Supreme Court upheld the CA's decision, but they tweaked how they classified the complex crime.
Okay, how did they tweak it?
They called it murder with attempted murder, so they flipped it.
Interesting. So what was their reasoning?
Well, they laid out all the elements that make something murder under Article 248 of the Revised Penal Code. It has to be proven that a person was killed, that the accused did it, that there was treachery, and that it wasn't parricide or infanticide.
Right, those are the legal boxes that have to be checked.
Exactly. They also looked at what constitutes an attempted felony under Article 6 of the RPC. They said you have to start doing the crime, but something has to stop you from finishing it, something other than you changing your mind.
Okay, and those elements were definitely there, right?
Yeah, I mean, Nestor shot at Gerry, so there was clear intent to kill, but he missed, so the attempt wasn't successful. The Supreme Court also agreed with the lower courts on treachery when it came to the attack on Gerry. It was sudden, unexpected, and Gerry couldn't defend himself.
So no surprises there. But what about Jonabel? How did they apply the mistake in the blow concept to her death?
They were very clear. They said it was a classic case of aberratio ictus. That means even if the harm done is different from what you intended, you're still responsible for the consequences of your actions.
It's like that saying, you break it, you buy it.
Exactly. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. They also upheld the idea that treachery applied to Jonabel's death, even though she wasn't the intended target.
How did they do that?
They referenced a previous case, People v. Flora, and they said that the attack was so sudden and unexpected, it made her completely helpless. So in a way, she was in the same position as if the attack had been planned specifically against her.
Wow, so they really looked at the situation from her perspective, her vulnerability in that moment.
Absolutely. And the Supreme Court also agreed with the lower courts that the witnesses were credible. They pointed out that Nestor didn't have any real evidence to back up his claims about Gerry being drunk or Princess being biased against him. They also reminded everyone that using an alibi as a defense is usually pretty weak, especially when there are eyewitnesses who can put you at the scene.
So it sounds like the Supreme Court really did their due diligence.
Yeah, they really went through everything.
So what was the final verdict? What was the sentence?
Well, they decided that Nestor had committed a complex crime under Article 48 of the Revised Penal Code. That's when one action leads to two or more serious crimes.
Right, like in this case, attempted murder and murder.
Exactly. And the rule is you get punished for the most serious crime in its maximum period. For murder, that's reclusion perpetua to death. But because the Philippines doesn't have the death penalty anymore, thanks to Republic Act number 9346, the penalty became reclusion perpetua without the possibility of parole.
No parole. That's a huge difference.
Yeah. And to emphasize just how serious this crime was, they even referenced AM number 150802. It basically says that not having parole is like saying, hey, if we still had the death penalty, that's what you would have gotten.
Wow, they really wanted to make sure that the severity of the crime was understood.
They did. And they also updated the monetary awards based on the standards set in People v. Jiguetta. So they specified how much Nestor had to pay for civil indemnity, moral damages, exemplary damages, and temperate damages, both for the attempted murder of Gerry and the murder of Jonabel. And all of that with 6% interest from the date the decision became final.
Wow, that's a lot to process.
It is.
So for our listeners out there, what do you think they should take away from this case? What's the most important thing to remember?
You know, for me, what really stands out is how the law tries to deal with situations where the consequences of someone's actions are much worse than what they intended. You know, we have that Aberratio Ictus doctrine to make sure people are held accountable, even if they hit the wrong person. But then when you consider how treachery can be applied, even to someone who wasn't the intended victim, it really makes you think about the whole concept of responsibility in the eyes of the law.
Absolutely. You can't just say, oops, my bad, and get away with it.
Exactly. And it also forces us to consider how justice works when one single act can lead to so much tragedy, in multiple ways.
So for everyone listening, I want you to think about this. How does this idea of a complex crime help or maybe even hinder how we understand justice, especially when one action can have so many devastating consequences? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, leave us a comment below.
Definitely. And if you found this discussion insightful, please hit that like button.
And before we wrap up, let's quickly recap some of the legal principles that were central to this case.
First, we had the concept of a complex crime.
Also known as delito compleo. It's when a single action results in more than one felony, as defined in Article 48 of the Revised Penal Code.
Then there's attempted felony.
This is when someone begins to commit a crime but doesn't complete it for reasons outside their control. That's Article 6 of the RPC.
And of course, we have murder.
That's the unlawful killing of another person, often involving an aggravating circumstance like treachery. That's Article 248 of the RPC.
And speaking of treachery, or alavosia, that's when the offender deliberately uses methods to make sure the victim can't defend themselves.
Right. And last but not least, we have Aberratio Ictus.
Mistake in the blow.
Exactly. That's the principle that says you're responsible for the consequences of your actions, even if the harm caused is different from what you intended. That's from Article 4 of the RPC.
So those are the 5 main legal doctrines that played a big role in the Supreme Court's decision.
It was like a legal puzzle, and these doctrines provided the framework.
Well, if you found this deep dive into Philippine law and justice interesting, make sure you subscribe to the deep dive for more in-depth discussions of these kinds of cases and the legal principles behind them.
Yeah, join our community. We're all about exploring the stories behind the headlines.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.